Welcome to another video about dry-aged meat, the raw and uncut version. Although I'm not sure about the uncut part of it because I'm not used to talking while eating and I will have to slice the meat, so it will involve a little bit of video editing. But anyway, I'm having lunch right now, or as funny as it goes on carnivore, it's actually changed into a dinner because I had some other work to do. So for dinner right now, I'm having this dry-aged ribeye steak, straight from the fridge, so I did not do any cooking. I will just have to cut it and I can start eating. And it's a bit of automatic response. I always place some salt on the table, but this is dry-aged meat. I used salt to let it age in the fridge, so probably I won't be needing any salt. I recently made a short video about how I prepare the steaks for dry aging in the fridge. It's very simple. I buy a large piece of ribeye, in this case of about 4 to 5 pounds, and I slice it into 4 equal parts. And then you get these steaks with a thickness of about 1.7 inches. Then I simply rub them with salt, with a lot of coarse-grained sea salt, or in this case Himalayan salt, and I place it in the fridge. This steak over here is now 1 week old. I was too impatient to wait. I'm curious how it tastes. But there are some more steaks still aging further in the fridge. And probably I'll make another video about that as well later. Well, another aspect of today's lunch is that I am eating it raw. It's about 1 to 2 months that I gradually started introducing raw foods. Only meat, of course, and eggs. And now I have more or less adapted, my digestive system has more or less adapted to raw meats, but that didn't happen immediately. So although I've been on a carnivore diet for about 1.5 years, I always ate cooked meat, and I started cooking steaks, let's say medium, and then I gradually went towards medium rare, and the last year or so I was eating steaks mostly rare, or sometimes even blue rare. So I made a natural transformation towards raw meat, but it's now 2 months that I am actually eating raw meat, and I started actually in the wrong way. So my first raw meat experience was buying steak tartare directly from the butcher in those small cups. And that didn't work very well on a digestive system that was not perfectly adapted yet. I also ate those steak tartares on the road without thinking about the digestive part of it, and that immediately backfired. So the day later I had serious troubles on the other end. Meanwhile, I've learned a lot of methods to improve digestion of raw meat. First of all, I now drink a glass of water with lemon or apple cider vinegar, let's say half an hour or 1 hour before a meal. I have decided to take smaller portions, so on a cooked carnivore diet I would usually eat 1.5, sometimes 2 pounds of meat, and now I changed it to meals of, well, a little under 1 pound, and that helped a lot. And initially I didn't add any salt to the meat because somehow instinctively I felt that I didn't need salt. It tasted well, but then later on I learned that salt is an important ingredient for making stomach acid, the hydrochloric acid that's in your stomach, and it's that chloride part of the hydrochloric acid that you also find in salt, of course. So now I heavily salt my meat. Not too much, of course, but just as I did in the past. And also that helped a little bit. Then if you read on web pages about letting your pets, cats and dogs, adapt to raw meat, for example, you will often read that it's not a good idea to combine raw and cooked meat. So if I'm eating raw meat over here, I should wait, let's say, several hours before I have a meal based on cooked meat again. Somehow that doesn't combine well. So I also changed that in my diet. So when I'm eating raw meat, I'm just eating raw meat. And then I also discovered that eggs don't always combine very well with raw meat. And I think actually eating raw meat, when you eat raw meat, you become even more sensitive to any irritants that are still in your diet. So for me, that's personally egg whites, for example. So since eating raw meat, I more obviously feel negative effects from eating egg whites. I also feel more negative effects from drinking coffee, for example. In the end, coffee is still an irritant for your gut. And although I had no troubles drinking coffee previously on a regular diet, but also later on a cooked carnivore diet, I started to notice that the coffee did not have a good effect on my guts when eating a raw diet. So you could see that as a downside, but I think in the end, just as with the regular carnivore diet, it's an upside because you recognize anything that is not right for you. So I also eliminated coffee since about 2 or 3 weeks, and that greatly improved my digestive response to raw meat. Because initially, let's say once every 1 or 2 weeks, I would have serious troubles, a little bit of stomach pain, and then everything that I ate the day before would exit on the other end. And that doesn't happen anymore. And I'm also quite sure that it wasn't related to any pathogens in the meat or in contaminations, because this meat comes from a trusted source. It's grass-fed beef. It doesn't come from the supermarket, but from a local farm. And I'm quite confident also about the handling of the meat, that it's done in a hygienic manner. But still, I had some digestive troubles, and I think that is just a response still from my body adapting to the raw meat. It's also very different from a true food contamination because when you have a stomach flu or an infection, you tend to feel sick for a longer time. And in my case, with eating raw meat, I just had a bad response several times, but it's sort of a reset. Everything leaves the body and I'm feeling still perfectly fine, and my digestive system is all good again. So that's about the digestive part. Related to that, we're eating raw meat here, of course, so that's scary. I personally also was afraid a lot from raw foods in the past. I remember that I was always very afraid of eating meatballs that were not cooked well enough. Typically, when you would make a cake or a birthday cake, for example, on a regular diet, children always like to scoop out the remainders of the cake mix. Well, I didn't do that because it contained raw eggs. So I was very afraid about that. But during the carnivore diet, I gradually changed my mind about this. So occasionally I will eat a raw egg yolk, for example. As long as you think well about what you're doing, if you get your meat from a trusted source, if you eat whole pieces of meat as well, then you're safe. For the eggs, the contaminants, the pathogens are only on the shell of the egg usually, if they are there at all. And for meat, the same holds. If you have a whole piece of meat, the pathogens are only on the outside, unless of course the cow itself was sick, but that's not the case here. And then when treating the meat, when aging the meat, I'm also adding a lot of salt on the outside, so it becomes safer again. Any bacteria that would be there, because bacteria are everywhere, even on a clean and trusted piece of meat, there are bacteria. But those bacteria don't like living in a salted environment. So this meat now has been in a strongly salted environment. It soaked also a lot of the liquid from the meat. So it created a very harsh environment for bacteria. And it's no different than, for example, eating a raw Parma or Serrano ham. And also another parallel that you can make is the raw meat that you find in a restaurant, for example. If in a restaurant you're eating a steak tartare, it sounds very exclusive, but in the end you're also eating raw meat. So let's give it a taste. I'm very curious myself. First, we have to cut the meat. And when it comes to cutting, that's also a thing that I experienced. In the very beginning, I used a plain kitchen knife to cut the meat. But since it's uncooked, it still contains a lot of the tougher pieces of the meat. So this piece of meat, when you first touch it, it feels quite solid, although also the lean part, let's call it like that, is quite tender. But there are some more tough pieces in it, and of course that's not very nice while eating. Already in general, eating raw meat takes a little bit more time than cooked meat, just like eating cooked meat, cooked steak requires a little bit more time than eating a meatball or a hamburger, for example. So cutting it in very thin slices will help to chew it more easily, and it makes the eating experience more enjoyable. And when eating with other people, that also prevents awkward situations that you are still chewing on your piece of steak while the rest of the company has been waiting and maybe already started with dessert. So let's cut the meat and I'll be right back. Well, that's done. I don't cut everything because I will have to judge how much I want to eat. With raw meat, I absolutely don't want to eat more than I need because I trust that my body is telling me how much it needs, and if I start to eat more, I will only encourage digestive trouble. So let's have a look at the meat from nearby. The meat looks very much basically like raw ham. Or another comparison that I could make is beef bacon. At my butcher I can buy beef bacon and that has exactly the same purplish color. Then we have these nice fat pieces. They are very soft. It's almost like candle wax. But I like those very much. So although it's like candle wax, it is really very delicious to eat. The only downside of this fat is that, well, since it's like candle wax, it tends to stick in between your teeth, and that type of fat takes a little bit of effort to remove. Well, it's a very soft meat, and actually this piece of steak doesn't have that many of tough parts in it. Let's give it a taste. I start with a little bit of fat. Also because it is dry aged, the fat sort of, I think, has absorbed also flavors from the surroundings in the meat. Because a lot of things are happening. You put salt on the outside, but fluids and salt, they are moving through the piece of meat. So it's making changes also taste-wise. And then also a lot happens with aging. I don't know the mechanisms behind it, but it does change the taste overall. Yeah, it has this typical aged smoky sensation. I'm having smoked salt here on the table, but for dry aging this steak, I used plain salt, that is non-smoked salt, sea salt. But still it has this smoky sensation. And in taste-wise, it is a middle road between beef bacon, raw ham, and obviously ribeye. And sliced like this, it actually chews away easier than cooked meat almost. With cooked meat, you tend to have the risk that you overcook it, for example, and then it becomes just horrible to eat, and you have to do a lot of chewing. And that's not the case here. Well, with all the meats so far that I ate raw, I didn't experience that it became uneatable or that it required a lot of chewing. One exception maybe is lamb meat. Several days ago I tried lamb shoulder, and that is quite a tough meat, and also the fat was really integrated with the muscle meat, so it was difficult to reach most of the fat. Well, that could have been a property of that specific piece that I got, But maybe that's true for lamb meat in general. I will still have to experience that. But this piece, it's very nice. It's always good to chew very well. I have to remind myself of that as well. Because although meat gets digested already in your stomach and your small intestines, I think it's still good to help digestion a little bit. And especially, of course, in the case of raw meat. That's very nice. And as a true carnivore, of course, I'm eating with my hands. I will have a paper towel to wash my hands, to clean my hands afterwards, and then I will wash them. So no use in worrying about forks and knives while eating. And this is also a nice experience, especially with the fat, if you just eat it directly from the big piece of meat. And that's a funny thing. 2 years ago, before going carnivore, I would have never imagined to eat a meat-only diet or to eat, for example, 10 eggs a day. And now I am eating raw meat. I'm eating it with my hands and I enjoy it. I'm halfway eating my steak now, so maybe before finishing it, it's interesting still to discuss why I started eating raw meat. And in a way, there wasn't really a why, because I naturally went from eating medium and medium rare meats gradually towards rare and blue rare meats. And then that final step towards raw meat basically wasn't there anymore, because in my opinion, whether a meat is blue rare or raw is hardly any difference. There are two aspects still that are different. There is, when you eat a blue rare steak, there is still a nice crunchy outer layer. And cooking that outer layer, of course, also provides this little bit of additional safety when eating raw meat. So I still often eat blue rare meat as well, and I also still eat cooked meat, of course. It's about 50-50, I think. But if I would have to find a reason why, then I'd say that is the cooking and washing the dishes aspect of cooked meat. So even when you make a blue rare steak, you have to take a pan out of the cabinet and do all kinds of preparations and cook it, and afterwards clean the dishes. Well, that seemed a little bit of much work for just the difference between blue rare and raw. Besides that, and that's a bit more controversial, but one could say that certain nutrients are more available in raw meat. I don't know about protein, it might actually be on the contrary, that by cooking meat the proteins become more available. But when it comes to especially vitamin C and maybe certain B vitamins, I can imagine that eating the meat raw actually has a beneficial effect. It increases the absorption rate of those vitamins, or it also avoids the vitamins being eliminated all the way. So yeah, there you have it. That are my experiences with eating raw meat, my considerations. And yeah, a final question could be like, should I start eating raw meat as well? In my opinion, eating raw or cooked meat overall is just the same in terms of nutrients. You can easily go on a cooked carnivore diet. So you don't necessarily have to go raw for the nutritional aspect of it. I personally simply went raw because I like the taste and the texture of the raw meat. So if you know yourself that you like things like carpaccio and beef tartare, well, then consider eating some more raw meats here and there. But by no means do it if you don't feel comfortable with it or if it's not your thing. I hope this was useful. and maybe I'll see you when I make a video about the next dry aged steak in probably about 1 week. Meanwhile, I'll continue eating.